Freddy Krueger, one of the most iconic slashers from horror movies, was introduced in Dead by Daylight way back in 2017, but his DLC has the most infamous reputation out of all licensed chapters, with one of the most hated maps in the entire game, a survivor that became a meme, and a killer that got reworked 3 times, and who to this day still has 0 cosmetics to choose from. Let's take a look at the Nightmare's complete history, from a killer who couldn't even attack survivors to a rework which made him the deadliest character in DBD, only to take that away, leaving him as a complete joke for years, and how now he is once again holding the title of the deadliest killer in Dead by Daylight. The problems with Freddy Krueger started even before he was publicly announced by Behavior. As you may know, old Dead by Daylight was a completely different game when compared to the modern version we have. Behavior was still a small company owned by Starbreeze Studios, so they didn't have the developing power of today, nor the ability to pump a chapter every 3 months. Back in the days, we didn't know when the next chapter was released, and so all we had were leaks and rumors. And the leaks were also completely different from today. Whereas now, most of the leaks come from insiders, the leaks from 2017 all came from data mining the game, as the developers weren't that good at keeping secrets from the most dedicated players. And that's when, on the 6th of October, some users found code and audio files that belonged to a killer internally named as Sandman, and one of the audios was this. If this audio were to be true, there was no way this didn't belong to Freddy Krueger. The hype was very strong, as we would get another icon of horror in Dead by Daylight, as Leatherface released less than a month from this leak, and Myers was the big chapter of Halloween from 2016. However, there was a problem with this chapter in specific. Did Freddy Krueger fit Dead by Daylight? This was a real question that many players were wondering, as Freddy was not a quiet slasher like Myers or Leatherface were. Without his charisma and his one-liners, he is not Freddy Krueger. And in this moment, Behavior said that no characters, killer or survivor, would ever speak so as to not break the atmosphere that they created. This would later end up aging like milk, considering just how much voice lines add to characters like Chucky, Wesker, Dracula or Vecna. 10 days after the data mine, Behavior would go on with a teaser to confirm that Freddy Krueger was indeed coming to Dead by Daylight, and later on, they would do a developer stream where they would talk about 3 of his perks as well as Pharmacy. In this livestream, they didn't talk about his power, they didn't show his appearance, nor did they talk about the survivor or the map. They did show the icons of his add-ons, and some in the community noticed that the dress add-ons belonged to children that were part of the 2010 remake of the film, and not the original movies, which disappointed a lot of the fans, as that movie, despite getting a lot of money, was not regarded as very good by many. This was confirmed with the release of the DLC on the 26th of October. We didn't get Robert Englund, as instead we got the Jackie Haley version. We didn't get Nancy, and instead we got Quentin Smith, who looked like a goblin and not at all like the actor. And as for Freddy, well, let's talk about his power. The way Freddy Krueger's original power worked is completely different to his reworked versions, and nothing like any other killer in the game. For starters, as long as a survivor was awake, you couldn't attack them or interact with them at all. Anytime you did a basic attack, your claws would go throughout the survivors in a really cool effect, and you had no collision whatsoever with them. In fact, for awake survivors, Freddy was completely invisible, and the only thing alerting his presence was the lullaby, which was only heard by awake survivors, unlike today. Another key difference is that survivors didn't fall asleep automatically. Instead, you had to put survivors to sleep manually with your Dream Demon power. By holding the power button, Freddy would bring his hand out, and any survivor hit by your Dream Beam would start falling asleep for 7 seconds. You heard me right. Survivors had 7 seconds where they were completely invulnerable to Freddy Krueger's attacks. And now, once a survivor was asleep, what did you get? The ability to attack them with your basic attack. Freddy didn't have any anti-loop powers on his kit, no mobility powers either. He had to play by the rules of an M1 killer, just like Trapper or Myers did. And this was way back when pallets used to spawn everywhere and there were busted windows as well. However, survivors did have problems inside the dream world. First of all asleep survivors suffered from an insane action debuff of 50%, which could be buffed further with add-ons, so repairing generators or healing others inside the dream world was absurdly slow. But that's not all. The aura of any asleep survivors outside of your terror radius would be revealed to you at all times, and combined with Freddy's incredibly small terror radius of only 16 meters, this meant that you could stop chasing a survivor after a hit to know where they are anywhere in the map. In fact, for the first time ever, Insidious was a legit perk choice for Freddy mains of that time, because you could stand still during a chase and you would have wall hacks anytime Insidious activated. Remember that way back, the HUD also barely gave info to players, so survivors didn't know who was asleep and who was awake just by looking at the icons. So how did survivors escape from the dream world? Well, there were 3 ways, and dream clocks were not one of them, as they were introduced in the first rework of the character. The first way was to get hooked, because in the past, even if you were downed, Freddy could slug you on the ground and find you anywhere in the map due to the aura reveal. The second way was to have an awake survivor do the clap clap thing on you, waking you up. And finally, survivors could wake up by missing any skill check. And this is where the problems began, all because of one perk in specific, Original Self-Care. See, this perk was not a trash pick like it is today. Self-Care was absolutely everywhere as one of the best perks in the meta up until patch 6.1.0, as it allowed survivors to constantly heal themselves the moment they escaped a chase, with or without a medkit. This meant that as long as you were injured, you had access to skill checks during a chase, and all survivors had to do was get enough distance from Freddy, start self-healing, and spam the skill check button only to instantly wake up, and then Freddy would have to start the 7-second process all over again. The missed skill check didn't even have to be from you. As long as any other survivor missed a skill check, you would wake up. So a group of survivors stacking on a generator and spamming the skill check button would instantly wake all of them at the same time. And something really weird that always bothered me was how the devs insisted that Freddy was supposed to be some powerhouse in the endgame. All of Freddy's perks were related to the endgame, and during the developer stream, they made it clear that these perks would be very good on Freddy.
This middle one is called Blood Warden.
Blood Warden.
And is quite handy, especially with Johnny.
Yes.
Johnny Luger.
However, Freddy was at his weakest in the endgame because he could do nothing to prevent survivors from rescuing others, as he was the only killer in the game unable to camp or tunnel, because he could not interact with survivors for 7 seconds. In fact, because of the crazy auto-aim that the game had, if a survivor tried to body block while awake, Freddy would attack the awake survivor and miss on the asleep one, and good survivors could abuse this. Extending the endgame is indeed great on Freddy, not because he is strong there, but because he literally needs those seconds in order to have time to injure a survivor in the first place. Also, remember the dream beam of Freddy? Well, if you hold it out too long, Freddy would get massively slowed down, and this was made by design in order to prevent players from holding the power out and rotating the camera everywhere in order to find hiding survivors. But this made Freddy feel very clunky. By this point, it's easy to understand that original Freddy was a complete joke, and he would be F tier on every single tier list, right? Well, that's not what the survivors of this time thought. In fact, Freddy would get 4 massive nerfs to his power only 2 weeks later, and that was because this DLC got review bombed with a lot of negative reviews, complaining that Freddy was the most busted killer Behavior had ever made. How is that even possible? Well, the answer is pretty simple. It was a massive skill issue, and the truth is that survivors of this time absolutely sucked. Back in the days, the game was still a small, casual indie experience. There weren't countless content creators running streaks or explaining how each killer worked extensively and how to counter them. In fact, the vast majority of players were completely clueless, so they didn't know how Freddy's power worked. They didn't know that he could see you at all times, so they tried to hide against Freddy, and survivors were significantly more scared of the killer than they are now. So greedy survivors, or comp survivors, barely existed at this age. A solo queue player with zero idea of how he worked, with zero teammates that could help them out, and especially without access to medkits or self-care, suffered a lot from this power design. Even concept-wise, it was flawed, as missing a skill check is something all survivors are taught not to do. So having the counterplay be to literally want to miss a skill check goes completely against the core gameplay of Dead by Daylight, and having a killer that could also completely remove the stealth aspect of the game ruined the hide and seek fantasy of the players, which was a very popular playstyle back when the maps had insane fog and were very dark. So Behavior's answer to this problem was to completely gut his power to the ground. Now survivors had to be away from your tear radius for 10 seconds before their aura was revealed, so no more insidious plays. His tear radius was increased to 24 meters from 16 to allow survivors more chances at escaping him, and his movement speed penalty while putting a survivor to sleep was increased from 1 second of slowdown to 3 seconds in order to give survivors some counterplay, since 7 seconds of warning was apparently not enough. Additionally, dying survivors who were healed to the injured state now woke up, so Freddy had to put them to sleep again in order to down them back, so slugging Freddy was no more. This left Freddy in a very pathetic state. His power was basically useless the moment survivors knew what to do against him, but it was busted against clueless players who complained about how unfun he was to play against. His perks were meh at best, as outside of Blood Warden, they were barely used. In fact, did you know that Fire Up used to only work after the second generator was repaired, instead of the first one? As for Quentin, not only did he have to suffer from the problem of being ugly as hell and the fact that he was a nobody compared to Nancy, his perks sucked too, and the map was also extremely hated, as it was just a different version of Haddonfield, which at this time was a very survivor-sided map. But the worst part for most was that this was the remake Freddy and not the original one. Freddy was silent. He didn't make any cheesy quips when attacking survivors, no iconic phrases at all. In defense of Behavior, however, I do have to say that this was not their fault, and this was the best they could do, all because of the context that we know of what happened behind the scenes with this license. During the early times of development for Dead by Daylight, Behavior tried to get as many licenses as possible into their game, but they didn't expect any of them to answer. With Halloween already accepting being part of DVD, they wanted to get other horror icons like Freddy, Leatherface, Jason, someone from Saw. Surprisingly, the license holders of Leatherface actually came to Behavior for a chapter release, so they started working on him. But, out of nowhere, New Line Cinema also agreed to have Freddy in Dead by Daylight, so they had to make a choice and pick one of them for the big October release. In the end, Leatherface got the short end of the stick, releasing with a mess of a power that was reused from Hillbilly, as even the add-ons were copy-pasted. There was no survivor and no map either, and Behavior tried to cook something with the small time they had left. Even the creators of the Batham map admitted it on their own ArtStation profile. They said that due to licensing contracts, they had to release the DLC in October, so they worked very hard in order to pump this chapter out. Crazy to think that the reason why this map is so bad is because it was literally rushed. Considering how there were significantly less developers then, I would say they did the best they could. And due to how they were a small company, they could not negotiate things like they can now. For that reason, Behavior didn't get the original Freddy, and that's why he does not have a single unique cosmetic, and most likely never will, because the contract didn't include any possibility for them to make cosmetics for Freddy in the first place. Remember that Freddy Krueger is older than the cosmetic store of Dead by Daylight. But when you think about it in retrospect, the remake version of Freddy makes more sense for DVD than Robert Englund. Jackie's portrayal of Freddy was significantly more sinister and dark, as he took the role seriously like a monster. With Robert, it felt more like a comedy, so considering what DVD wanted to portray itself as, the remake Freddy is significantly a better fit than the original Freddy. Despite that, this is very tragic, because had they gotten the rights to Freddy today, we know for a fact that Freddy would have had amazing voice lines and unique cosmetics, just like Chucky does. In another universe, we would be playing Robert Englund. I would say that it's impressive how Freddy is still in the game and how they allow Behavior to make reworks to this character after so long, considering how Mortal Kombat 9 had to be delisted from the Steam store because they lost the rights to Freddy Krueger. Even then, this was the best that fans could get based on the circumstances, and some people decided to stay with this version of Freddy, even after the nerfs. This weird power he had was a very cool portrayal of how his dream powers worked in the movies, and with some of his add-ons, which were completely different, you could make Freddy work. The most notable add-ons were the toy block add-ons, which decreased the time to put survivors to sleep, the pill bottle, which made you invisible to survivors until they fell asleep, the iridescent brush, which made Freddy feel like the pre-nerf version, and the class photo, which gave you the location of every single survivor in the map at the cost of increasing the sleep timer by 2 seconds. The only good change he got is that the slowdown he got because of holding his dream beam that I mentioned earlier was removed, and they made him walk at 95% speed instead. This version of Freddy would last up until the 23rd of July 2019, where Behavior, for the first time ever, would make a complete redesign of Freddy's power. The aim of this rework was pretty simple: make Freddy Krueger a killer with an actual power, and the only way the devs found to do that was to completely scratch the mechanic of not allowing Freddy to injure survivors that are awake. This was achieved through the concept of micro sleeps, a crucial mechanic in the 2010 remake. Now, instead of survivors being completely invulnerable to Freddy Krueger, he would actually exist for them outside of the dream world, phasing in and out of existence the further away he were from the survivors. just like it happens in the movie. And now, he can attack survivors directly in order to bring them to the dream world. No more aiming a dream beam at survivors and waiting for them to fall asleep for 7 seconds. Freddy could finally work like a normal M1 killer would. But that's not all. Survivors would also fall asleep passively without Freddy's intervention in order to prevent Freddy from being a normal M1 killer against good awake survivors. And this is once again taken straight from the 2010 remake. Funny how with the rework, the killer became more accurate to his portrayal of the remakes. As for the asleep survivors, their dynamics in the dream world completely changed. Instead of all the strength from Freddy coming in a passive way with the aura reveal as well as the massive slowdown when repairing generators, Freddy was now the character that got buffed inside the dream world, as he got access to 2 powers you had to choose from before starting a match: the dream snares and the dream pallets. Freddy could place dream snares over the map in order to slow down asleep survivors that step on them, as well as making them scream and revealing their aura. The dream pallets, on the other hand, were exclusive to a certain type of add-ons, and these would replace your dream snares with fake pallets that you could place on spots where pallets didn't spawn or were broken. For survivors inside the dream world, these pallets looked normal, but once they threw them down, they just exploded in blood, allowing Freddy to get a hit thanks to them. Finally, Freddy had some sort of anti-loop power incorporated on his kit. But that's not all, as Freddy had a last trick up his sleeve, and that was the dream projection, as Freddy could teleport to unrepaired generators from anywhere in the map, giving him the very first manual map teleport power of the time. You could also cancel this teleport, baiting survivors into leaving the generator and wasting time, or use the teleport during a chase in order to cut off survivors. Out of all the changes from this rework, the generator teleport was my personal favorite. This all came with a small catch. Now that the dream world was easier to get as a survivor, the devs also wanted a way for them to leave it without needing a teammate or without failing a skill check. So they finally added the dream clocks, which only worked once you were asleep, and the furthest clock from your location would be revealed, letting you wake up. That's it. So it seemed like the devs overcompensated with Freddy's flaws, as they gave him basically everything for his kit. You had passive stealth, an anti-loop power, an insane map mobility power, a form of tracking thanks to the dream snares, and passive slowdown as survivors had to go to the clocks further away from them in order to wake up. It's safe to say that this version of Freddy was busted, and he became a true monster against solo queue, going from a killer that only a very small portion of the community played to the killer with the highest kill rate in Dead by Daylight. However, the actual reason as to why Freddy had such an insane kill rate was not only due to the kit being busted, it was also thanks to the discovery of one of the most boring builds ever made, Forever Freddy. See, while the slowdown penalty while being asleep was completely removed from his base kit, some of his add-ons actually brought that part back. The jump rope add-on gave survivors inside the dream world a 9% penalty for repairing, healing, and sabotaging, and the swing chains add-on gave a stackable 3% penalty to those same actions, which also applied to awake survivors. This meant that just with the add-ons themselves, you could slow down the progress of every single survivor by up to 21%. And remember that the slowdown was a completely passive thing, so if survivors didn't want it, they had to walk around the map and wake up with the clocks, or miss skill checks, which would apply a 10% regression penalty to the generators they were repairing. Combine this with the original effects of Tinkerer, which revealed the location of generators that were about to be repaired, and you could teleport to them from anywhere on the map in order to keep them regressing thanks to Ruin, which in this version, it was still the old design where skill checks would regress the generator by 5%. Then, with Thanatophobia, you could add an extra 16% penalty to all actions, which was harder to get rid of as Sloppy Butcher would make healing speeds even slower. And this build was absolutely disgusting to play against, as Freddy had all of those benefits just by existing, thanks to the passive sleep. As a survivor, the only chance you had against a Freddy with this build was to hope to find Hex Ruin early in order to gen rush the killer, or hope that the Freddy was brain dead. Yet it was still an insanely unfun experience, because it was not interactive in any way. Of course, this was a problem for the health of the game, as survivors simply gave up against him or just disconnected from the matches since he was that boring to play against. Even the rework of Hex Ruin didn't do much against this build, as the perk still worked perfectly with the character, and even worked better when combined with Tinkerer and his teleport. Forever Freddy would be the killer with the highest kill rate in Dead by Daylight for over 2 years, with his reign ending on the 4th of May 2021 with patch 4.7.0, where he would eventually get a massive nerf to keep him in check. The first thing the devs did in order to completely kill Forever Freddy was to rework the effects of the slowdown add-ons. Now, these add-ons would do stupid effects like increasing the volume of survivors' footsteps and grunt noises, which was basically useless. But that's not all, as Freddy was considered overtuned by the devs even without this build, so he got 3 extra nerfs along with the add-on rework. Freddy would now be slowed down when putting the dream snares around the map. There would be 3 snares less, going from 8 snares to only 5, and by far the most impactful change was the introduction of the sleep immunity mechanic, which made it so that survivors grabbing a dream clock would have a 30-second grace period where Freddy could not make them fall asleep even if they got hit. This meant that as long as survivors were interacting with the dream clocks, Freddy was rendered as an M1 powerless killer that could sometimes teleport to generators. And this is where Freddy finally fell to oblivion, as now his power was gutted. The dream snares were just a worse version of the clown's bottles, and Clown was already considered a very weak killer at this time. Freddy's generator teleport, while unique in the past, was now the worst teleport in the game, as anytime a generator was repaired or blocked, you could not teleport to them, which means once again, the killer who was marketed as being very strong in the endgame ended up being at his weakest on it. Characters like Demogorgon, the Onryo, and Dredge completely outclassed Freddy's generator teleport, and with each teleporting killer added, like Singularity, Xenomorph's tunnels, or the Unknown, his teleport was just worse and worse. The Dream Palettes also aged horribly, as Freddy had to choose them with add-ons instead of having them incorporated on his base kit. With the release of killers like Vecna or Dracula, Freddy aged even worse, as those two killers had various tools in their arsenal, so behavior could program a killer to have various powers in the same match. But by far the biggest problem of the new Freddy is that he lost his identity completely, and this is what the majority of Freddy mains disliked. With the rework, the original power of being completely invisible and putting survivors to sleep was gone, and instead replaced with a character that didn't feel like Freddy at all, and instead it was more like a gamified character made to fit the meta of Dead by Daylight. While you can argue that the generator teleport would be something Freddy would do, the rest of his kit just felt boring, which is very disappointing considering how Freddy Krueger's powers are limitless. He is a magic blood wizard, a dream demon, but in game, he was just a worse version of Clown, a complete joke. At least the original Freddy had something that made him feel unique. This is something that Behavior has gone on record saying that they hate doing. A true rework completely removes the identity of the original character, and this is something only reserved to absolute failures of design, like possibly Skull Merchant will. Nowadays, Behavior tries their best to keep the identity of the killers intact when reworking them, like they did with the Doctor, the Knight, the Legion, or the Leatherface. And this is to prevent players that fell in love with the original character to not feel left out when the new version came out, which is what happened to the original Freddy mains. Well, I lied. There was one thing that this Freddy and the original Freddy had in common, which didn't go away with the rework. While he was regarded by many players as one of the worst, if not the worst killer in Dead by Daylight, his kill rate indicated otherwise. Anytime the developers showed official statistics of the kill rates of the killers in Dead by Daylight, Freddy Krueger was consistently a top 5 deadliest killers in the game. So this meant that with the rework, Behavior came back to the exact same problem that original Freddy had in 2017. He was still a trash killer against survivors that knew what they were doing, but he was a noob stomper on lower MMR. Only this time, there was the extra of the community being pissed at Behavior for completely removing the original essence of Freddy Krueger's design. And for the longest time, that was what Freddy ended up being. A joke in the community. With each amazing license release, it was a further reminder at how bad Freddy was treated. No voice lines, no cosmetics whatsoever, and an absolute joke of a power. The only hope Freddy players had was another rework to his power, which was announced in 2023, but there was complete radio silence on when this rework would come out. Even Quentin Smith got a rework before Freddy did, as with patch 5.1.0 he stopped being the ugly goblin he used to be, and honestly compared to the old version, he looks like Prince Charming. In January of 2025, the long-awaited Freddy rework was officially announced. A lot of players were nervous about this, as the expectations were at an all-time high. When the devs showed what changes were coming with this new character, they were surprisingly good. The dream snares no longer worked like a trap that you have to place to slow down the survivors. Now, they work as a projectile that you can launch forward in order to slow the survivors down and also make them fall asleep when they are awake. So no longer was Freddy powerless against awake survivors. The dream palettes were finally part of the base kit of this character, and just like Vecna or Dracula, you can change between the snares and pallets, as they also received a massive glow up. You can detonate dream pallets from afar, while in the PTB, this feature sucked because survivors could just deactivate the explosion. On the live version, this was a very fun power that can allow you to get hits against survivors that are not careful enough. It makes Freddy feel like a trickster, using the utilities of the survivors against them. And the teleport was no longer the worst one in the game, as now you could teleport to repaired generators and blocked generators, something that was rumored to happen with the introduction of the Houndmaster's ability to send the dog to repaired generators. In fact, one add-on even lets you teleport to exit gates too. And that's not all, because the original feel of Freddy was something that the devs tried to incorporate on his power. The ability to be present at all times and know where survivors are when they are inside the dream world. Now, anytime a survivor heals another while asleep, Freddy can see your location and teleport there from anywhere, so survivors no longer feel safe inside the dream world. And all the add-ons were completely reworked, going from basically the worst add-ons in the entire game to each having a cool and unique effect which allowed Freddy the ability to do new interesting builds like he could never before. In fact, one of the iridescent add-ons even brings the aura reveal that original Freddy had for those players that missed that part of his power. There is even an add-on that brings back the old snares for those weirdos who found this power fun. This version of Freddy was met with a lot of positive feedback, especially the live release that fixed some of the problems he had in the PTB, like pallets feeling way too useless. It felt like behavior listened to both sides and made a compromise between the original version of Freddy and the new one. Freddy went from being one of the least picked characters in the entire game to immediately skyrocketing to the most picked killer, and now, after the hype has died out, he sits at a very nice above average pick rate when compared to other characters, which is impressive considering how 2 vs 8 is currently overinflating the pick rates of the Resident Evil characters. Finally, Freddy Krueger felt fun. His power was dynamic and it allowed survivors and killers interaction. He is not overpowered to go against, nor boring to play against either. Compared to the other character reworks we had recently, I would say that the Freddy rework is the most successful rework they have ever done, even better than the Doctor, the Knight, and the Leatherface reworks, which I consider to be some of the best. I am even scared of the fact that currently he is the killer with the highest kill rate in the game according to Nightlight, but I am hopeful that he does not get any nerfs whatsoever, just like Vecna didn't get one yet. New Freddy is not overpowered, nor problematic like before. He is considered by many players to be a B tier character at best, but compared to what an absolute mess he was in the past, and considering how much of a mess he used to be, I would gladly take this version of Freddy over the chance of having yet another failure in Dead by Daylight. But there was still one problem with it, and that is the fact that even after all of this, Freddy still doesn't have any cosmetics or voice lines whatsoever. Even after being in what I would say is the best state Freddy Krueger has ever been, we have to live with the fact that the version we got in Dead by Daylight, the Museum of Horror, is a version of Freddy that many players will agree is incomplete. I hope you enjoyed the video, thank you for watching and have a nice day.